The stars were silent, but the war was not. For 60 years, the Galactic Allied Council had been fighting a war it could not win. 14 species, some with wings, some with tentacles, some who breathed methane and saw in frequencies no human eye could process, had pooled their fleets, their soldiers, their resources, and their last remaining hope into one desperate effort to stop the Vreth Dominion from swallowing the galaxy whole. It hadn't worked. The Vreth were not just powerful. They were organized, relentless, and completely without mercy. Their warships were built like moving fortresses, plated in layered composite armor that could absorb a direct torpedo strike and keep going. Their soldiers had 4 arms and bones reinforced with a dense mineral that made them nearly impossible to kill with conventional weapons. Their commanders had spent centuries sharpening tactics that turned every battlefield into a killing ground for anyone who faced them. One by one, the great fleets of the GAC had been broken apart like ships smashing into rocks in the dark. The Thalvari, whose silver warships had once been considered the finest in the known galaxy, lost their entire Third Armada at the Battle of Velon's Reach. The Aresi, tall, proud insectoid beings, who had not lost a ground war in over 300 years of recorded history, were swept off 4 colony worlds in a single week. The Keth, the Maradi, the Shalor, all of them had given everything they had, down to their last ship, their last soldier, their last breath. And it still was not enough. Now, the GAC Council sat inside a space station orbiting a dying red star at the edge of neutral space. And the mood in the chamber was the mood of people who had already surrendered inside their own hearts, but had not yet found the words to say it out loud. The council room was large and circular, built so that every species could sit at the same level and look each other in the eye. Around its wide table sat representatives from every member world. Some wore armor that still showed the scorch marks and dents of recent battles. Some had bandages wrapped around limbs. Some simply stared at the table surface and said nothing at all. The holographic display floating in the center of the room showed the current state of the war. Red for Vreth territory, blue for the GAC. The red had spread so far that it almost filled the display completely. Then the message came. It broadcast through every channel at once. Every GAC warship, every station, every colony still standing received it at exactly the same moment, with no warning and no way to block it. The voice was deep and measured, and spoke with the particular tone of someone who had already decided how things were going to end. This is Supreme Warlord Kael'vor of the Vreth Dominion. Your fleets are broken, your armies are scattered, your leaders are hiding. I am giving you 72 hours to transmit your formal surrender. After that time, I will no longer be interested in terms. I will only be interested in outcomes. The message ended. No music, no dramatic pause. Just silence. Nobody in the council room moved for a long moment. The holographic display still glowed quietly in the center of the table. All that red eating up all that blue. Then the voices started. Representative after representative rose from their seats, and they all said versions of the same thing. They had to find what terms were still available. There was nothing left to fight with. Continuing the war was not courage, it was a waste of lives that served no purpose. The Vreth were too many, too powerful, too deeply embedded across occupied space. The numbers were not complicated. They had lost, and the only question left was how much more damage they wanted to absorb before they admitted it. Provisional agreements were sketched out. Language was debated about what a dignified surrender might look like. Some of the representatives wept without trying to hide it. Others had gone so far past the point of tears that they simply sat still with empty eyes. And then, from the far end of the table, a chair was quietly pushed back. Ambassador Sarah Voss of Earth stood up. She was not a large woman. She stood at average height, dark-eyed, wearing a plain gray uniform with no decoration on it. She had sat through the entire session without speaking a single word. and if most of the council was honest with themselves, they had barely noticed her there. Earth was a member of the GAC, yes. Humans were a recognized species, yes. But they were young by galactic standards, barely a few centuries into space travel, and no one in that room had thought of them as a factor in any of the war's calculations. She reached into the case beside her chair and placed a single document on the table in front of her. She slid it toward the center of the table, where the council's senior administrator picked it up with careful, thin fingers and read the title printed at the top. His voice did something unusual when he read it. It hesitated. The human activation request. The room changed. Not with noise, but with a sudden stillness that was different from the tired quiet of before. Every representative looked up from whatever they had been staring at. Some leaned forward without realizing they were doing it. Earth formally requests authorization to enter the war, Sarah said. Her voice was steady and unhurried, like someone who had rehearsed these words for years and was finally saying them at exactly the right moment. We are ready. Councillor Varric of the Thalvari, an elder whose silver crest feathers had gone completely gray, turned to the Aresi delegate seated beside him. He spoke in a low voice, almost to himself. The humans, he said slowly, they have been watching this whole time. The Aresi delegate had no answer for him. A broad, stone-skinned Marathi representative across the table cleared his throat. He had lost 3 of his sons in the first decade of the war, and his face carried that loss in every line of it. Ambassador Voss, he said, keeping his tone measured, with respect, we have deployed fleets numbering in the tens of thousands. We have used weapons capable of cracking the crust of a moon. We have given everything, and it was not enough. What exactly does Earth believe it can contribute at this point? Sarah looked at him steadily. A different approach, she said. A few representatives exchanged glances. Someone let out a short, quiet sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. It was not a cruel sound. It was the sound of beings who were too exhausted and too broken to react with anything more than that. Sarah waited for the room to settle. When it did, she spoke once more. Give us 72 hours. If we have not changed this war by then, you can sign whatever you need to sign. No one agreed out loud. The motion was left hanging in a heavy, uncertain silence, and the session ended without a decision. Far from that dying red star, in the cold dark beyond Jupiter, something began to move. A Vreth scout drone, running a standard sweep of the Sol system, registered one large warp signature emerging from the shadow of Europa. Then a second, then 10, then 50. The young Vreth technician monitoring the feed ran the scan twice, then a third time, certain the equipment had failed. It had not failed. The signatures kept appearing. Enormous ones. Readings the drone's recognition software could not match to any known vessel class in the Dominion's 60 years of accumulated records. Not Thalvari design. Not Oresi. Not anything that had ever been pointed at the Vreth before. Something new was coming out of the dark. The technician flagged the report as highest priority and sent it up the chain immediately. By the time it reached Kael'vor's command ship, 4,000 human warships were already in formation, silent, precise, and ready, pointed at the heart of the Vreth Dominion. They had been waiting a very long time for this. 60 years ago, when the first Vreth warship crossed into the galaxy's outer edge and burned a small Thalvari colony to nothing, the Galactic Allied Council sent urgent messages to every member species. They called for solidarity. They called for ships. They called for whatever could be spared. Earth's response came back 3 days later. It was polite, it was respectful, and it said in careful diplomatic language that humanity needed more time to assess the situation before committing forces. The GAC accepted this answer with quiet frustration. Humans were young. Their technology, while promising, was not yet at the level of the older species. It made some sense that they would hold back. A few Thalvari generals privately said that asking humans to fight the Vreth at this stage would be like asking a child to lift a warship. You didn't do it because you didn't want to watch the child get crushed. What nobody understood was that Earth was not hesitating out of fear or weakness. Earth was calculating. Deep inside a classified facility built into the iron-rich rock of an asteroid in the outer belt, the Strategic Intelligence and Readiness Engagement Network, SIREN, as its operators called it, had been running without interruption since the first reports of Vreth aggression reached human ears. It was not a single computer. It was a network of processing systems spread across 6 separate locations, all linked together and all focused on one question: how do you win a war against an enemy that has already defeated every civilization that tried to stop it? SIREN ran simulations. It modeled fleet engagements, ground invasions, supply line disruptions, weapon effectiveness, species psychology, tactical patterns, resource consumption, and dozens of other variables across every possible scenario its operators could feed it. Human analysts worked in shifts around the clock, reviewing the outputs, adjusting the parameters, running the numbers again. The results were consistent and deeply uncomfortable. In almost every scenario where humanity entered the war early, the outcome did not change. The GAC still lost. Humanity's forces were consumed, their technology captured and studied, their contribution absorbed into a long list of failed efforts. Worse, in many scenarios, human involvement actually shortened the war, by giving the Vreth new resources to take and new territories to occupy. Early entry didn't help. It just added names to the casualty lists. But there was a different set of scenarios, a narrow band of outcomes where things went differently. In those scenarios, humanity waited. Humanity watched, gathered information, and used every year the GAC bought with its blood to build something that had never existed before. Not just more ships, not just better weapons, a completely different way of fighting, built from the ground up to beat one specific enemy, using everything that 60 years of observing that enemy could teach. The winning scenario required patience. It required restraint that went against every human instinct that said, help your allies now. And it required absolute secrecy, because if the Vreth learned what Earth was building in the dark, they would not wait for it to be finished. Admiral Jonas Hark had been read into the SIREN program on his 32nd birthday. He was a quiet man by nature, careful with words, and careful with trust. When the full scope of the program was explained to him, what they were building, why, and how long it would take, he had sat in silence for several minutes before asking a single question. Does this actually work? The analyst across from him had put a projected probability number on the screen. It was not a perfect number. Nothing in war ever was. But it was the best number humanity had found in 60 years of looking. And it was significantly better than anything else available. Hark had nodded once and said he was in. That had been 22 years before the GAC Council meeting, where Sarah Voss placed a document on a table and watched the room go quiet. In the years between, the thing that SIREN had planned was built inside the magnetosphere of Jupiter, hidden from Vreth sensors by the planet's own massive electromagnetic field. The shipyards were constructed first, enormous frameworks floating in controlled orbits, staffed by rotating crews of engineers and workers who lived in the yards for months at a time and spoke to nobody outside the program. The ships came next. They were called the Iron Veil Fleet, and they did not look like anything else humanity had ever built. They were not designed for ceremony or tradition. No polished hulls, no elegant lines borrowed from ships that had come before. Every centimeter of every vessel had been designed with one purpose in mind, and that purpose was simple. Destroy the Vreth Dominion efficiently and completely, with the fewest possible losses on the human side. Human engineers had studied every piece of Vreth technology they could get their hands on. Salvage from GAC battlefields, intercepted signal data, physical debris recovered from destroyed vessels. They understood how Vreth shields worked, how their targeting systems processed incoming fire, how their captains made decisions under pressure, and they built against all of it. The gravitic lance array was one result of that work. Traditional weapons fired projectiles or energy beams in straight lines at enemy shields. The Vreth had very good shields. The array didn't fire through them. It bent the local gravity field around the target so that the shot curved around the shield entirely and struck the hull directly underneath. The Vreth had never encountered anything like it, because no other species had ever combined gravitics and weapons engineering in quite that way. Human researchers had come to it not because they were the most advanced species, but because they were looking at the problem from a completely different angle than anyone else. There were other weapons. The Tesseract net, which could fold a section of space around an enemy fleet and prevent faster-than-light escape, had taken 11 years to develop, and had killed 2 of its lead engineers in testing accidents. The Ghost Drive, which reduced a ship's sensor signature to almost nothing at sublight speeds, had gone through 47 failed versions before the 48th one worked. Nothing about the program had been easy. Everything had cost something. But it was finished. All 4,000 ships of the Iron Veil fleet were armed, crewed, tested, and waiting. The soldiers trained for ground operations had run the same assault scenarios so many times that they could execute them in the dark. The strike teams who would cut through enemy supply lines had memorized every route, every relay point, every weakness in the Vreth logistics network. Intelligence gathered quietly over 60 years had given humanity a map of the enemy that no one else in the galaxy possessed. Now, on the bridge of the flagship UNSS Unconquered Sun, Admiral Jonas Hark stood in front of the main display and watched his fleet form up around him. 4,000 ships, holding position in the dark beyond Jupiter, silent and invisible and ready. His communications officer reported that Ambassador Voss had delivered the activation request. The Council had not formally approved it, but they had not rejected it either. And in the absence of an answer, the standing order was clear. 60 years of planning did not wait for a committee vote. Hark looked at the display for a moment. All those years, all that waiting, all that restraint, all those times he had watched GAC fleets burn on the intelligence feeds and forced himself to hold position because the numbers said it was not time yet. It was time now. He straightened and turned to face the bridge crew. They were all looking at him. Some were young. This was the first real engagement of their careers. Some were older, and he could see in their faces that they understood exactly what this moment was. He kept it short. All Iron Veil units, this is Admiral Hark. We have our orders. Engage. Show them why we waited. 4,000 engines lit up at once, and the dark side of Jupiter blazed with blue light. The Vreth had 72 hours to wait for a surrender. The Vrentos corridor was a graveyard. It stretched across 6 light minutes of open space between 2 dead star systems, and in 60 years of war, it had become one of the most fought-over pieces of empty nothing in the galaxy. Hundreds of battles had been waged here. Thousands of ships from a dozen different species lay broken and cold along its length, some of them still slowly tumbling end over end, their hulls split open and dark. The debris was so thick in places that navigating it required constant course corrections. The Vreth liked fighting here. They had won here so many times that the place had become something like a point of pride for their commanders. It was where they had broken the Thalvari Third Armada. It was where the last great Oresi fleet push had collapsed into nothing. It was, as far as the Dominion was concerned, a place that had already proven what the galaxy's order of power looked like. Fleet Commander Aurak Death stood on the bridge of his command ship, the Eternal Claim, and watched the long-range sensors with the casual attention of someone who had already decided what they were going to see. When the report came in that a human fleet had entered the corridor, his first reaction was mild interest. 4,000 ships was a reasonable number, he supposed, for a species attempting something dramatic. But his own force totaled over 24,000 vessels, positioned in the deep layered formations that had crushed every opponent who had tried to push through this corridor in decades. The math was straightforward. He told his sensor officer to give him a count and a class breakdown on the incoming fleet. The officer studied his display for a moment and then looked up with a slight expression of confusion. "Commander, the design classifications are not matching anything in our recognition system." "Then mark them as unknown class and continue," Aurak Death said. He was not concerned. New ships with unknown designs still had to fly through the same space, still had to absorb fire and return it, still had to obey the same physical rules as everything else. 4,000 ships did not become dangerous simply because their hull shape was unfamiliar. His second-in-command leaned over from an adjacent console. "Orders, Commander?" "Standard formation. Forward line advances on my mark. We engage at optimal distance and let them break themselves on the shield wall, same as every other time." He glanced back at the display. "Signal the captains." Mark. On his display, the 24,000 ships of his forward fleet began their advance in organized columns, a deep wall of firepower, moving toward the incoming humans in the same measured, proven manner that had worked dozens of times before. Aurak Death was watching for the human fleet to take up a formation of its own. Something defensive, he expected. A tight cluster, or perhaps a broad line, the two shapes that most species fell back on when faced with a numerically superior opponent. What happened instead made him straighten slowly in his command seat. The human fleet did not form up. It split, not randomly, with a precision that was almost uncomfortable to watch. 4,000 ships divided themselves into 9 separate groups in less time than it should have been physically possible to coordinate. And those 9 groups immediately began moving on different headings. Not retreating, not holding, moving. Each group angling in a different direction, spreading across the corridor in a pattern that didn't correspond to any tactical formation his training had prepared him to recognize. "What are they doing?" his second-in-command said. Aurak Death didn't answer because he didn't know. His forward line was still advancing, organized and powerful, and now it was pushing into a corridor where the enemy was spreading out in all directions around it, rather than meeting it head-on. His commanders began requesting updated engagement orders. He told them to hold formation and proceed. The humans were splitting their force and reducing their firepower concentration. This was a mistake, not a maneuver. Then the first group of human ships fired. Aurak Death watched his shields light up on the damage display, and then frowned. The shields had lit up, but the damage readings beneath them were wrong. Damage was being registered on hull sections that his shields fully covered. His shields were active and functioning and showing normal performance, but ships were being hit through them. He looked at the readings again, convinced something had malfunctioned. Nothing had malfunctioned. The human weapons were not hitting his shields. They were going around them. The shots were curving, actually curving around the edge of his shield projections and striking the hull underneath. He had never seen this. He had never heard of this. He had spent his entire military career believing that shields worked because weapons traveled in straight lines, and straight lines could be stopped. These did not travel in straight lines. In the space of 4 minutes, 17 ships in his forward line were venting atmosphere. In 8 minutes, the number was 43. His commanders were screaming for instructions, and he had none to give them, because nothing in any tactical framework he had ever learned covered this. You could not angle your shields against a weapon that curved. You could not adjust your formation against an attack vector that didn't hold still long enough to define itself. The 9 human groups were not fighting as one fleet. They were fighting as 9 separate problems, each one attacking a different section of the forward line simultaneously. Each one using the same curving fire that no breath shield could stop. Each one moving with a speed and coordination that seemed impossible for a fleet operating across that much space. He called for emergency countermeasures. His ships began returning fire, focusing their weapons on the closest human groups. The human groups moved. Not randomly, efficiently. They didn't retreat. They simply stepped sideways, repositioned at angles, and kept firing. His targeting systems locked on, and the humans adjusted. His gunners compensated, and the humans adjusted again. It was like trying to hold water in a clenched fist. Far behind the battle line, aboard a GAC observation cruiser that had been monitoring the Vrenthos corridor from a safe distance, a group of Allied commanders and analysts watched the engagement feed in silence. Counselor Varric of the Thalvari stood at the front of the group, his gray feathers very still. He had commanded fleets for 30 years. He had fought in this corridor twice and lost badly both times. He understood warfare at a level that most beings never would. He watched the human fleet dismantle the Vreth forward line with a calm efficiency that he could not find words for. He watched the curving fire. He watched the 9-group formation that shouldn't have worked, but was working flawlessly. He watched the Vreth commanders trying to respond and getting nothing right, because everything they knew about fighting assumed the enemy would behave in ways that these humans simply were not bothering to behave. He turned to the Aresi general beside him. "They have been holding this for 60 years, he said quietly. The general watched the display without responding for a long moment. Then, "They were never holding back because they were afraid." "No," Varric said, "they were not." On the bridge of the Eternal Claim, Aurak Death was receiving the damage report from the first hour of engagement. He read it 3 times, because he was certain the numbers were wrong. 600 Vreth warships destroyed, another 90 heavily damaged. His forward line, the same forward line that had held this corridor against every GAC push for decades, had been torn apart in 60 minutes. Human losses, 0. Not low, not minimal, 0. He stared at that number for a long time. Then he sent an urgent priority transmission to Supreme Warlord Kael Vor's command ship. Across the length of his war record, across 30 years of battles won and enemies broken, Aurak Death had never sent a transmission like the one he sent now. He had never needed to. The message was short and carried a word in it that Vreth commanders almost never used, because their language had the word, but their culture rarely had reason for it. The word was help. Kael Vor read Aurak Death's message twice. Then he set it down and looked at the space ahead of him through the wide viewport of his command ship, the Dominion's Fist, and he spent 30 seconds doing something he had not done in a very long time. He thought carefully. He had not built the Vreth Dominion into the greatest military power in the known galaxy by being reckless. He had built it by knowing his enemies before they knew themselves. He had studied every species the Dominion had ever fought. He had learned their patterns, their fears, their limitations, and he had hit them in exactly the places those patterns could not protect. That was why 60 years of war had gone the way it had. He knew nothing about how humans fought. He had read the reports from the first hour's engagement twice now, and what they described was something he could not fully model, because the information didn't fit any framework he had. Weapons that curved. Formations that didn't hold still. A fleet that functioned as 9 different threats simultaneously rather than one combined force. 0 losses in 60 minutes against his best forward units. He gave himself those 30 seconds. Then he made his decision. He pulled 17,000 ships from the occupation lines on 3 different fronts and ordered them toward the Vrenthos corridor. He would not send more units into that fight piecemeal, the way Orok Death had done. He would bring everything, and end this quickly, before the human fleet could make the problem larger than it already was. He did not know that this was exactly what Admiral Hark had planned for him to do. The Vrenthos engagement had never been the point. It was the loudest thing happening in the war, which made it the thing a careful and intelligent enemy commander would focus on. While 17,000 Vreth ships pulled off their occupation positions and routed toward the corridor, the space they had been occupying became, very briefly, unguarded. The ghost ships moved. 240 small, dark vessels had been holding position at the edge of sensor range for the last 72 hours. They were built around one principle: be invisible. Their hulls were coated in a layered material that absorbed sensor pings rather than bouncing them back. Their engines ran cold, venting heat through channels that redirected the signature in 30 different directions at once, so that no single vector ever registered a reading large enough to trip an alarm. They did not communicate with each other by any signal that traveled outward from the ship. Everything was tight beam, directional, and gone in an instant. In 60 years of building the Iron Veil fleet, the ghost ships had been the most expensive piece of the program per vessel. They had also been the part that almost no one outside Siren knew existed. They entered Vreth-occupied space in 3 waves, slipping through the gaps left by the departing warships, like smoke through a broken window. Their targets were not military vessels. They were not looking for combat at all. They were looking for the network. The Vreth Dominion's greatest operational strength after its military was its logistics. Every occupied territory, every garrison, every supply depot was connected by a web of relay stations and communication nodes that allowed Kael Vor to coordinate the movement of resources across the entire Dominion in near real time. It was what made them so hard to fight. Even when you damaged one part of their operation, the rest of the web compensated and kept everything running. GAC commanders had tried to attack this network before, but they had never had a complete map of it, and the few nodes they managed to hit were always replaced. Humanity had spent 60 years quietly mapping every relay station, every depot, every junction point, every backup node, every redundancy in the system. Intelligence teams working through intermediaries and captured salvage had reconstructed the entire Vreth logistics network so accurately that Siren could model its behavior under any disruption scenario. They knew which nodes were critical and which were decoys. They knew which depots held what supplies. They knew which relay stations, if destroyed simultaneously, would cause the entire network to lose cohesion rather than simply rerouting around the damage. The ghost ships hit 47 targets at once. Not one of them fired a weapon. They used a different system, a signal injection tool that fed corrupted instructions into each node's control system, causing it to send incorrect routing data to every connected station before going dark. The Vreth technicians monitoring the network would see failures appearing, try to diagnose the problem by running system checks through the network, and those system checks would carry the corrupted data further. Within 2 hours, the logistics system that had kept the Vreth Dominion moving for 60 years was feeding itself false information and beginning to break apart from the inside. Supply ships started arriving at the wrong coordinates. Garrison commanders started receiving orders that contradicted each other. Reinforcement requests were logged, confirmed, and then the ships dispatched in response were routed to locations that didn't correspond to any actual emergency. The Vreth system was not failing because humanity had blown it up. It was failing because it was being fed bad information and acting on it. On the occupied colony worlds, things were different. Humanity had not forgotten the beings living under Vreth control. The ghost ships were not the only ones that had moved while Kael Vor was watching the corridor. 48 landing craft, each carrying a strike company of human ground soldiers, had been descending through the atmospheres of occupied worlds since the second hour of the engagement. The Vreth garrison troops left behind on those worlds were experienced and disciplined, but they were configured for holding territory against the populations they occupied, controlling civilian movement, enforcing supply requisitions, suppressing organized resistance. They were not configured for an assault by soldiers who arrived fast, hit specific targets with precise coordination, and disappeared before a response could be organized. The human ground teams did not try to hold ground. They destroyed garrison command structures, communications towers, and supply caches, then extracted and moved to the next target. Vreth units responding to one attack would arrive to find nothing there, and receive reports of another attack somewhere else. Within the third hour, garrison commanders on 6 different occupied worlds had declared local emergencies and were demanding support from a logistics network that was no longer capable of accurately processing their requests. On the colony worlds, the occupied populations, species of every kind that had been living under Vreth control for years, watched human soldiers come down out of the sky and begin dismantling the structures of their occupation. There was no celebration yet. Most of them had been under long enough that hope was a thing they approached carefully. But they watched the humans move, fast, focused, businesslike, and something started to stir in them that had been quiet for a long time. A Thalvari child on one of those worlds, a girl who had been born after the Vreth came, crouched behind a wall with her mother and watched a human soldier run past in full kit. The soldier caught sight of them, stopped for one moment, and gave the child a small nod before moving on. It was a tiny thing. It took less than 2 seconds. The child held onto it for the rest of her life. Back at the Vrenthos corridor, Hark was watching 17,000 ships come toward him on the display. His fleet had remained in formation, holding the ground it had taken in the first hour. The 9 groups had consolidated into a tighter configuration, and Hark had spent the second and third hours positioning them with quiet care. He had been waiting for exactly this, for Kael'vor to strip his lines and commit everything to the corridor. For the Vreth to do the predictable, rational thing and meet the threat directly with overwhelming force. His weapons officer asked if they were going to fall back to better defensive ground, given the incoming numbers. Hark looked at the display for a moment and shook his head. "We're not moving." Around the bridge, a few people exchanged glances. 17,000 ships against 4,000 was not good math by any normal calculation. But Hark was already watching the corners of the display, watching the signatures appearing at the edges of sensor range, signatures that had been dark and invisible until the moment they were given permission to stop being invisible. The Tesseract net was a system that required 12 anchor ships positioned at precise intervals around a target zone. Those ships had been cloaked and holding position for 11 hours. They had not moved. They had barely even run their engines. They had just waited, cold and silent, for the moment when a large enough Vreth force entered the correct coordinates. The 17,000 ships were almost there. At the start of the 4th hour, Harky gave one quiet instruction. Activate the net. 12 anchor ships lit up simultaneously. Between them, space itself bent, folded inward like the edges of a sheet being pulled toward the center. The fold was not visible. It produced no light, no explosion, no dramatic display. But every jump drive aboard every Vreth ship caught inside the field suddenly registered the same catastrophic error. There was nowhere to jump to. The coordinates that should have existed beyond the fold were gone. Faster than light travel required stable space-time to navigate through, and the space inside the Tesseract net was no longer stable. 12,000 Vreth warships, the ones deep enough inside the net's radius, were not going anywhere. Kael'vor, watching from the edge of the formation, understood what had just happened 2 seconds before his sensor chief confirmed it. He understood it because he was intelligent and because the evidence was simple. His fleet was inside something, and something was keeping it there. His hand hovered over the direct command panel on his chair. For the first time, in a very long time, he was not certain what to do next. Kale Vor had never asked for help in his life. He had never needed to. From the moment he had taken command of the Dominion's military 40 years ago, every war he had fought had gone the same way. Find the enemy's strength, neutralize it, then crush what was left. He had never been outmaneuvered. He had never been caught in a position he had not anticipated. He had turned the Vreth Dominion from a regional power into the dominant force in the known galaxy through a combination of patience, intelligence, and the absolute certainty that if you prepared well enough, nothing could surprise you. He was surrounded now. 12,000 of his ships were trapped inside a field of bent space, unable to jump, unable to run, barely able to maintain formation, as the human fleet pressed in from multiple directions, with those impossible curving weapons tearing through hulls that their shields could not protect. The ships outside the net's radius had reversed course and pulled back, but they were disorganized, stripped of their coordination structure by the logistics network that had gone dark 3 hours ago. Commanders were broadcasting on open channels, trying to find out what their orders were, because the chain of command, built on a logistics and communication system that no longer worked properly, had fallen apart. The logistics network collapse alone would have taken the Dominion months to recover from under normal circumstances. The ground operations on the occupied worlds had turned garrison units into scattered, reactive groups chasing targets that were never there when they arrived. The trapped fleet was taking losses that his damage estimates said would reach total destruction within 90 minutes if nothing changed. Nothing was going to change. Kale Vor was an honest thinker. It was what had made him good at what he did. And honest thinking, applied to the situation in front of him, produced one clear answer. He opened a direct hail channel to the UNSS Unconquered Sun. The response came back in seconds. The face on his screen was not what he had expected. He had imagined, in the brief moment before the channel opened, that he would see a human commander who looked triumphant, someone wearing the expression of a victor, who wanted the defeated to know exactly who had beaten them. Military theater. He had performed it himself enough times to recognize it. Admiral Hark looked tired. Not exhausted, not defeated, not unsure, just tired in the way of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and is only now setting it down. He was seated at his command station, and his expression was composed and quiet. Admiral Hark, Kale Vor said. He had decided to use the man's name and rank. Whatever was about to happen, he would not begin it without that. Warlord Kale Vor, Hark replied. There was a pause on the channel. Kale Vor found that he was taking longer to begin than he normally would, because the question he wanted to ask was the question a defeated commander asked, and he had never been a defeated commander before. He asked it anyway. How? He said. Hark looked at him for a moment without answering right away. Then he leaned forward slightly. You made one mistake, he said. His voice was even, almost conversational, like he was explaining something simple. You looked at every species in this galaxy and asked how strong they are today. You measured us, you found us acceptable to dismiss, and you went on. We looked at you and asked a different question. We asked, how do we make sure you never threaten anyone again? Not today, not in 5 years, forever. He paused. You fought our war on your terms. We didn't fight your war at all. We planned our own. Kale Vor was quiet for a moment. He looked at the damage feeds on his secondary displays. He looked at the numbers that didn't change no matter how many times you looked at them. You waited 60 years, he said. Yes. While your allies bled. Something shifted slightly in Hark's expression, a small tightening around the eyes. That was the hardest part. Vor sat back in his seat. He thought about what it took to hold an entire species back from a war for 60 years. To watch allies die and hold position. To build something in the dark, while the galaxy assumed you were irrelevant. To carry that knowledge and that plan and never once break, never once move too early. He had thought he understood patience. He was now less certain. My forces in the corridor are trapped and will be destroyed within the hour, he said. My logistics network is non-functional. My occupation garrisons are reporting operational collapse on 6 worlds. My reserve lines have been stripped and cannot reconstitute quickly enough to present a coherent defense. He stated each point flatly, in order, the way a good commander assessed a situation, even when the assessment was entirely against himself. The Vreth Dominion formally requests terms of cessation. On a GAC observation ship at the edge of the corridor, every representative who had been watching the engagement feed heard those words come through the broadcast. The room was completely silent. No one moved. Then Councillor Varric of the Thalvari made a sound. It was a quiet sound, low and somewhat rough, the kind that comes when something that has been held tightly for a long time finally releases. He was not the only one. The formal surrender was processed and transmitted within the 5th hour. Vreth commanders across the Dominion received the order from Vor himself. Stand down, hold position, await the terms process. Most complied. A few did not, and had to be persuaded by the continued presence of Iron Veil fleet units. The persuasion did not take long. When Ambassador Sarah Voss returned to the GAC Council chamber, the room felt different from the last time she had stood in it. Then it had been a chamber of defeat, heavy with exhaustion and the quiet grief of beings who had given up. Now there were beings standing. Some were speaking loudly, some were crying and not trying to hide it. The displays showed blue pushing back across the galaxy map in real time as occupation forces stood down, and GAC ships moved in to secure liberated territory. Varric met her at the entrance to the chamber. He was a very old being, his crest nearly white now, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body had decided it was done moving quickly. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a long moment. Then he bowed. It was a deep bow, slow and formal, the kind his species reserved. She knew this. She had studied Thalvari culture before she ever set foot in a council chamber. For beings they considered to be on a level entirely above ordinary respect. Warriors who had turned impossible odds into victory. Figures from their history who had changed the shape of the future. She bowed back, which was the correct response, and she kept her expression steady. Later, in the session that followed, the GAC formally recorded the end of the 60-year war. Several representatives moved to offer humanity territory, resources, and seat positions of expanded authority within the council. The offers were generous and genuine, and some of them were very large. Sarah declined each one quietly, and put forward the single request that Earth had authorized her to make. Every species that lost something in this war, rebuild it together. That's what we want. The request was not what anyone had expected. A species that had just ended a 60-year galactic war with 5 hours of combat had asked for nothing except cooperation. The chamber sat with that for a moment. Then, one by one, the other representatives added their voices to the formal acceptance of her proposal, and it passed without opposition. On the unconquered sun, Admiral Hark stood alone at the main viewport after the ceasefire confirmation came through. The bridge crew was celebrating around him. Quiet, steady celebration. The kind that soldiers allow themselves when they understand what they have just come through. He could hear their voices behind him, and he was glad for the sound of them. He looked at the stars. Somewhere out there, 60 years of war had just stopped. Somewhere out there, occupied worlds were receiving the news. People who had lived their entire lives under someone else's control were going to go to sleep tonight and wake up tomorrow into a different kind of world. A junior crew member approached quietly and stopped a few feet behind him. "Admiral," she said, "are you all right?" He thought about the question for a moment. He thought about 60 years, about the simulations and the shipyards, and the long, cold patience of building something in secret while the galaxy burned. About every intelligence feed showing GAC fleets breaking apart that he had forced himself to watch without moving. About the engineers who had died in testing accidents, whose names were on a wall inside the Siren facility that nobody outside the program would ever see. About all the things that had gone into this moment that the galaxy would never fully know. He thought about all of that. Then he turned around and he smiled at her. "Ask me again when everyone's home," he said. Across the galaxy, in more than 200 languages and dialects, the same story traveled outward from the Vrenthos corridor like ripples across still water. It changed words and changed shape as it moved, picked up different details from different mouths, grew and shifted as stories do when they travel far and fast. But the core of it stayed the same everywhere it went. The humans had been there all along, watching, waiting, building something in the dark that no one knew about because no one had thought to ask. And when the moment finally came, when the galaxy was at its lowest and the enemy was at its most certain, the humans had stepped forward, not with rage, not with desperation, with a plan 60 years in the making and 4,000 ships to carry it out. And they had done it in 5 hours. The war was over. The galaxy was not yet sure what to make of the species that had ended it. They were young, by the standards of civilizations that had crossed the stars for thousands of years. They had no ancient empire, no legendary history of conquest, no monuments built across centuries that pointed to what they were capable of. They had just shown instead. And the galaxy had a very long memory.